Welcome to another Woke Wednesday, and I am grateful for the Black Church Action Fund and the Black Church PAC for creating this space during Freedom Summer for us to have very critical conversations about the integrity of our democracy, about the future of that democracy, and what our role is as persons who are committed to fighting and protecting the freedoms that have been denied to people of African descent for so long, but what people of African descent believed were possible and have continued to fight for. And so we are grateful that this Freedom Summer is an opportunity virtually for people of faith to stand up and occupy their role, occupy our roles as democracy first responders. As our democracy is wounded, it has consistently been Black folk of faith, Black folk who are followers of Jesus that have consistently fought for an America that they have loved, even when that country did not love them. So that's the beauty of Freedom Summer, that we are in the lineage of democracy first responders, people who stood up for this country and believed that America was possible. And that is the legacy that we stand in today. That is the legacy that we breathe oxygen into today as we gather. And I'm excited that we are able to have this conversation around economic justice, principally around what does it mean to unleash the real economic power of our government, and what it means to live out and live into an economic imagination that has often been starved in this country. Many of us have particular understandings of how our economy works, of how our money works. We have particular understandings around what's possible fiscally based on a type of economic orthodoxy that has never really served the interests of our government as an institution, or the interests of our government as we the people. And so I'm excited today that we have two persons who are radically committed to economic justice as an article of faith of Black religion, economic justice and liberation as an article of faith for what it means to be a follower of Jesus. I'm grateful to have Deirdre Reed, who is a lifetime organizer, who has organized principally around economic justice in so many areas. Anti-poverty work in so many areas has been her forte. It has been her life's mission, and we're grateful to have her with us today. And we know, and I trust that her conversation, her contribution today will meet at the intersection of so many of those ideals of those fundamental rights that we need to fight for. I know her comments will pivot around that. And we're grateful to have the Reverend Dr. Delman Coates, who's the pastor of the Mount Enon Baptist Church in Clinton, Maryland. He is also the founder of Our Money, which he'll talk more about in a minute, which is a movement around economic justice, the likes many of us are not familiar with, but we will become familiar with as the weeks, months, and years roll on. And so thank you both for being with us today. And just before I toss this to Dr. Coates, who is the founder of the Black Church Center for Justice and Equality, a theological think tank and policy advocacy organization that I happen to be the president of, thanks to him. Just before I tee it up to Dr. Coates, I think it's important for us to remember that this is, and I don't think you can overstate that this is the most important election of our lifetimes. It pains me how hackneyed that sort of sounds at times, because I feel like I say that every election cycle of my lifetime, but I'm leaning on the fact that maybe that is true. Maybe every election is always the most important election, the most consequential election. I do fundamentally believe that, but I do want to be clear that there are existential threats that are being leveled at the American people, and particularly, and in the real sense, the global stage that are at stake in this election. And we want to center this conversation, principally the conversation around why should we be voting? What is the point of turning out the vote? I want us to ground that in the economic future of our households, the economic future of our nation. I am becoming grossly aware that telling people to vote because their ancestors marched, died, and sweated for that is not the kind of rallying cry that's working these days. But I do think there is power in thinking about how do we personalize policy? How do we let people know that policies that shape our lives, policies that determine what's on our dinner table, policies that determine how empty our wallets can be, policies that determine where we live, and even how we can live are reasons for us to vote. And so the capacity to make policy personal is what I think has to be a part of our theory of engagement, our theory of change, our theory of mobilization this election cycle. And so I'm grateful that the Reverend Dr. Delman Coates, the founder of Our Money, is going to help us see exactly how personal economic policy is. Dr. Coates, we're on you.
Well, good evening. Can you hear me, Willie?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Francois, for inviting me to share tonight on this Woke Wednesdays, and I want to thank Deirdre Reed. We're going to go ahead and dub her Dr. Evangelist Deirdre Reed. Deirdre Reed, so good to see you, and I'm just delighted to be here on this Woke Wednesdays as a part of Freedom Summer, to talk about a subject that is critically important to all of the activists, organizers, lay people, and faith leaders who are listening tonight. I want to talk tonight about modern monetary theory and the future of economic justice. I want to talk about that because we're meeting tonight in the midst of some critical times for our nation, for our community. We are definitely in the midst of a crisis, a public health crisis and pandemic, which has exacerbated the existing crisis in healthcare for people of color. There's a crisis of unemployment with over 50 million Americans unemployed and having filed for unemployment. I believe 56 million Americans without jobs, right, in the last 4 or 5 months. We also know with Breonna Taylor, as we say her name, and that case, and those officers have still yet to be arrested, and Ahmaud Arbery, and certainly George Floyd, and so many others, the 20 plus Black trans folks who have been killed just this year alone. There is a crisis of racism in our nation. There's a crisis of democracy when we see that the President of the United States is literally taking steps to impede voting and undermine the democratic institutions which undergird our nation. So we're in the midst of a crisis. And in the face of it all, people all across the country, activists and organizers, are in the midst of debating, how do we address the issues that people face in our community? It's one of the things that's really at the heart of my ministry as a faith leader, to relate the gospel to the range of real practical issues that people face today. Issues of unemployment. When people don't have a job, they're unable to provide for themselves and unable to provide for their families, and they're unable to have meaningful benefits that make life, that make it possible for them to exist in a sustainable community. When people don't have jobs, it forces them into the underground economy and forces them into a life of despair. People wrestling with issues of healthcare, right? Like I, as a pastor, I, like many of you, pastor people and serve in communities where people really struggle with whether they should go to the hospital because they don't have the money for the copays. They don't have, they struggle with, sorry, I'm getting folks calling me at the same time I'm doing this. They struggle with deciding, how they're going to afford the expensive medication. So there's a crisis of healthcare. People are living in communities with a range of environmental challenges, where there are people still in Flint, Michigan, who don't have clean water. There are environmental crises in our communities. Issues of public education, student loan debt, and the issues really go on and on. And with as many people who are watching tonight, all of us watching tonight have a range of issues confronting us. And the one issue that we have to face whenever we seek to raise the issues that face us in our communities is how we're going to pay for it. When you meet with your member of Congress, when you meet with your a representative in the House and your senator, they're going to want to talk about, well, how are we going to pay for it? We hear presidential candidates debating the merits of various policies, and in the debate and the discussions often center around how we're going to pay for it. Well, I want to talk about modern monetary theory and the future of economic justice, because there's a paradigm shift right now happening in the field of economics and public policy. That paradigm shift is called modern monetary theory, or MMT for short. It is a field of economic discourse. It is not an alternative economic system. It is a description of how our economy actually works. And there's a large body of academic research that has really been emerging over the last 30 years from some of the nation's leading economists. And I don't want to begin, calling the names, but you can look and Google modern monetary theory, MMT for short. And there are a range of policymakers, members of Congress, who are beginning to learn more about MMT and how it relates to bringing resources to bear by the federal government for our communities. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to share with those of you who are listening some core principles of modern monetary theory. As I launched a campaign in May of 2019 as a local pastor entitled the Our Money Campaign. Our website is ourmoneyus.org. The purpose of the campaign is to really just mainstream core concepts of modern monetary theory with the interest of pushing for passage of a set of broad-based public policies that would benefit every American. We must reclaim our democracy. We must reclaim our monetary system for the benefit of the American people. So let me just kind of walk through some core principles of modern monetary theory, and hopefully I'll be able to relate them to the issues that those of you who are watching are deeply concerned about. So the first principle of modern monetary theory is that the federal government is a currency issuer and not a currency user. In 1971, the United States monetary system went off what is called the gold standard. That meant that our money did not have to be, in theory, convertible to gold. And under that system, you can imagine that if those green dollars had to be converted, banks had to be able to convert those green dollars into gold, then the capacity of the federal government to create those dollars is limited and constrained by the gold requirement, because gold is a scarce commodity. So the possibility of the federal government to create money was viewed as limited or constrained by this commodity, gold. Well, in 1971, Richard Nixon took us off of the gold standard. That was a good thing, because you never want your money system backed by a scarce commodity. Well, when that happened, the United States government went from being a currency user to a currency issuer. It now can create money rather than being held hostage to using what was regarded as money in the old system, namely gold. And so the first principle of modern monetary theory is that the United States government, the federal government, is a currency issuer, not a currency user. And as such, the United States government can never go broke. This is very important. Think about it. You and I If we have debts or bills to pay, we're not able to create the money for that. But since the federal government is a currency issuer and not a currency user, then it can never go broke because it can always create the money to meet its obligations. This idea that the federal government is a currency issuer and a currency user is so subtle, but yet it's very significant, because even though we went off of the gold standard in 1971, many mainstream policymakers and economists didn't change their assumptions about the federal government's relationship to money creation, right? So we went off of the gold standard, but the economic assumption stayed the same. And MMT economists or other heterodox economists helped us to understand that when we went off of the gold standard, that changed the relationship between the federal government's capacity to create money when it comes to spending. Number two, the federal government is not a household. I want those of you listening to just say this with me. The government, I can't hear you say the government is not a household. Just joking, I can't hear you. When we say the government is not a household, we're talking about the federal government, not state and local governments. But the federal government is not a household is a phrase that's intended to articulate this point. Mainstream economists, traditional economists, because they assume that the federal government is a currency user like we are, rather than a currency issuer, tend to think about the federal government's budget like a household budget. In your home, you need a source of revenue first in order to spend, right? In order to responsibly spend, in order to go to the grocery store, in order to purchase gas, in order to buy clothes. You need some revenue stream first in order to spend. And it's regarded as fiscally irresponsible, financially irresponsible, for you to spend more than you bring in revenue. Well, many mainstream economists, since that sort of makes sense in your home, in your church, in your nonprofit, in your university, in your business, in your state and local government, since it makes sense that you need revenue first in order to spend, they assume that the federal government needs a revenue stream first in order for it to spend. Most often that revenue stream is regarded in the form of taxation or borrowing. So when they start imagining, what's possible for the federal government to spend on, they are limited to their notion of the revenue stream for the federal government. Tax revenue, and perhaps we can float bonds and get some and borrow the money. The problem with this is that MMT helps us to understand the federal government is not a household. It's not a currency user, it's a currency issuer. And as such, it does not need revenue first in order to spend. I really need you to get this. Because when we go to our members of Congress, they're going to start thinking in that conventional orthodox, economic orthodox framework about whether we have the capacity to fund the money for the public schools, or for the after school programs, or for the healthcare initiatives, or for the job creation opportunities, or to invest in roads and infrastructure and build bridges and clean water and all of this. They're going to feel like, oh, we can't afford that because there's only a fixed amount of money that the federal government has in order to spend on that, right? Well, MMT says the federal government's not a household. It doesn't need revenue first in order to spend. And we just saw in March and in April, in the passage of the 3 stimulus bills, in which the federal government literally spent and created $3 trillion without a source of revenue first. Think about it. Those stimulus packages were passed without taxing Warren Buffett, Jeff Bezos, Amazon, Jay-Z, Beyonce, people making over $250,000 a year. The federal government just created the money without needing a source of revenue first. If we go to war, God forbid, the federal government does not say, oh, well, in order for us to drop a bomb and to build tanks and warplanes, we need to first talk about who we're going to tax first in order to address that national priority. No, the federal government creates the money when it does that. So the second principle is the federal government is not a household. It does not need revenue first in order to fund the things that we need. Thirdly, the third principle that I want to share is that the way that the federal government creates money is something that forces us to think differently about something called deficit spending. So the way the federal government creates money is when it deficit spends. This is very important. In your home, deficit spending is regarded as negative. In your business is bad. As a clergy leader and pastor, the easiest way to see yourself out of the door is to continue to spend more than the institution is bringing in revenue. But because the federal government is not a currency user like we are, but as a currency issuer, deficit spending is generally not bad for the federal government. It's good. Federal government is what we call in our money campaign, net public money creation. It is how the federal government puts money in circulation. Because when you understand what's called sector balances, when the government sector is in deficit, that's the federal government is in deficit, then the non-government sector, that's us, we're in surplus. That is why the stimulus is regarded as good, because when the government deficit spent, when it created that $3 trillion, it was in deficit. It added to the federal debt, so-called, and I'll get to that another time. But in so doing, that created a surplus in the non-government sector. It put money into the hands of citizens. I want you to think of an example that we often use in our training sessions. I want you to imagine me being the federal government's treasury. And let's say I pay you, a teacher, $1,000 for a week of work. This is just for illustrative purposes. If I pay you $1,000 and then I tax out $500, then the federal government's books would be in deficit $500, because a deficit is when you spend more than you bring in revenue. So if I spent 1,000 and I brought in revenue 500, my books are in deficit 500. But your books, on the other hand, your wallet will show that you're in surplus 500, because you received 1,000 and you paid back 500 in taxes. So the federal government's deficit of 500 resulted in a surplus of $500 for you. And with that $500, you can buy fruit, you can go to the movies, you can put a little money away, you can support a business, you can buy t-shirts, whatever you want to do, give tithes to your church. Now, if the federal government's budget principle is to balance its budget, then let's go back to the same example. If it spends 1,000 with you, in order for its books to be balanced, it has to tax out 1,000. And while it can say, wow, my books are balanced, that's great, I'm fiscally responsible, you, on the other hand, you don't have any money left because you received 1,000, but then you had to pay back 1,000 in taxes. And now the question becomes, how are you going to get money for food, to pay your rent, to buy gas, to go to the movies, do things that you like, pay your tithes? Well, where do you get that money from? And where you get that money from is you borrow, you take out credit, you take out a loan. And we regard in our money campaign, in the range of economists, we regard this form of reliance on bank money as the underlying systemic problem that the American people face, because the average person works 40 to 50 hours a week to pay interest on borrowed money. Think about it. Most of your paycheck that you receive at the end of the week is to pay interest on credit, your mortgage, most of which is interest, your car note, your school loan, department store credit cards, etc., or credit cards, etc. And that is because when the federal government doesn't do enough robust spending on public priorities and putting more money in circulation, when it operates within this scarcity model imposed upon us by the economic orthodoxy, public needs don't get met. We end up starving. And then it forces us to rely on the financial sector, which loves to give us an unlimited amount of loans and borrowing, which then heaps up another set of problems where families are literally struggling under the weight of debt. Okay, let me move on as time goes on. So what we then understand is that the federal government is not constrained by revenue when it comes to spending. When a politician says the federal government can't afford a particular healthcare program, we can't afford to do this particular policy, It is misleading us. And right now, activists, organizers, lay people, and the American people have been misled. We've been lied to about the capacity of the federal government to invest in public priorities. There are no revenue constraints when you understand how the monetary and fiscal policy of our nation works. There are no revenue constraints that prevent the federal government from creating all of the money we need to address all of our greatest social and economic and existential challenges. The only constraint is inflation. Inflation is, the sort of limit of resources, labor, and materials that can cause too much money to chase a limited amount of resources, right? But other than the inflation constraint, which is real and legitimate, the federal government can create all the money we need to address our greatest economic challenges today. We just created $3 trillion in March and April, and the sky hasn't fallen. Hyperinflation has not happened. And there's much more spending capacity that the federal government has in order to address our greatest challenges. So once you understand these first three principles, you understand that we can afford everything that we need. If we change the way we understand and think about money, it takes the limit, it liberates us from the scarcity model that the financial sector and mainstream economists want us to operate in at the grassroots level when we organize. We can afford all of the things that we need. And when I say all of the things we need, I mean all of the things that we need, right? So then, and when we do not use the power of the public purse in our democracy, when we do not reclaim and affirm the power of the public purse to address public priorities, what happens? Well, public needs don't get met. Schools don't get invested in. Jobs don't get created. Healthcare is not provided. Clean water is not provided. And we're all left victim and held hostage to the predatory interests of the financial sector. So we must develop a movement of people who understand how our monetary system works, and then organize in such a way where we are demanding passage of a set of specific policies that prioritize the public interest over the special interests. Because when we underutilize the power of the public purse, that happens because you might ask, well, if the federal government has this enormous power of money creation, why aren't we doing it? Somebody's asking that. Well, if the federal government is not constrained and limited by tax revenue, if it has the capacity to invest in all of these priorities, if we can have a win-win economy to provide economic sustainability for everyone, why don't we do it? Good question. The reason is because the financial sector benefits and profits when the government does not create enough money to address public priorities. Yes, the bankers, the financial sector benefits when we're forced to rely on credit, on loans and lending. So that's why it doesn't happen. And many of these financial institutions invest in supporting politicians and campaigns, which is why it's critically important that we develop a movement of citizens who are educated about the workings of the monetary system and who understand that it's critically important that we harness the power of our vote, harness the power of the public purse to address public priorities. I want to close with this. I think my time is getting away from me. So then what are the policies that we should be demanding today? Because the issues we face today require us to demand bold solutions and bold policies, not just little tinkering around the edges, but we need bold solutions to address our priorities. And I just want to sort of tick off, sort of 3 or 4 things that the Our Money campaign is really working right now to educate activists, organizers, lay people, faith leaders, civil rights leaders right now to demand these core set of policies that are really the economic policies, which are really designed to supplement the range of other policies related to police reform, voting rights, criminal justice reform that people are demanding. But these are core economic policies that are critical. They are broad-based, they are robust, and they are critical because we need to have policies that prevent people from falling through the cracks. In this moment, this cannot be a moment where we just ask for a few more seats on corporate boards for people of color or for Blacks. Those things are necessary, but we've got to demand for more than that. This cannot be a moment where we just fight for more Black coaches in the NFL and the NBA. This has got to be a moment where we demand passage of policy so that no one can fall through the cracks. So the first policy is called a federal job guarantee. Economic justice is the unfinished work of the civil rights movement, and a key part of the civil rights movement was a demand, a policy demand for a dignified job with benefits for every American that wants one. It's called a federal job guarantee. Look up the book, A Case for the Job Guarantee, that just came out a few weeks ago by one of our economic advisors on our advisory campaign. Go to our website, ourmoneyus.org, but look up A Case for the Federal Job Guarantee. It was a proposal that was raised by Sadie Alexander. She is the nation's first Black economist in the 1940s. And what she talked about is that the way to help Black people buffer the kinds of racism that were happening in America was to provide them with a level of economic security, because the way in which we manage the economy today requires there to be 6 to 12% of the population being unemployed. And most of those 15 to 20 million people are going to be people who look like you and me. And so a federal job guarantee is a policy that says we're not just going to leave the issue of employment and job creation to the private sector, because the private sector is not incentivized to employ everyone and to get us to a full employment economy. A federal job guarantee says that there will be a public option for employment where the federal government will create public sector jobs at every level for different economic levels and provide a dignified job with wages. We're not talking about giving jobs to people and giving opportunities to people who don't want to work. These are people who want to work, provide for themselves. A federal job guarantee is critical. We need activists and organizers and lay people demanding that their organization, that their elected officials, that their candidates for public office are calling for and asking for a federal job guarantee. Secondly, Medicare for all. In a nation like the United States of America, we should have Medicare for all, where healthcare is regarded as a right and not a privilege. People should not die because they get a toothache or because they get sick or because they can't afford the medication or because they can't afford the procedure. We cannot leave healthcare up to profit-making institutions. And if people want to keep their private insurance, okay, fine. But we need to invest in providing quality public healthcare for everyone. The third policy that we're pushing for is federal funding of public education, pre-K through college, including for HBCUs. There is a two-tier system of public education in America. The reason that's happening is because we rely largely on state and local taxes to fund public education. We've got to end that. Since the federal government does not have this spending constraint, this revenue constraint, we need to demand federal funding of public education so we can have first-class schools and facilities and to pay for teachers funded by the federal government. Pre-K through college. Thirdly, we're calling for the abolition of student loan debt. Young people should not have to take out a loan to get an education, to get a job, to then spend the rest of their life to pay back that loan. We should have the abolition of student loan debt right now. And we pay for it by utilizing the power of the public purse, because the money is just digits into a computer anyway. Our tagline is change money, change the world. If we change the way we think about money, we can literally change the world. We have a policy platform, a policy agenda for Black America that also includes support for a Green New Deal to address the world's greatest existential threat, which is climate control. And we also have a policy that calls for the funding of the $4.6 trillion infrastructure budget of the American Society of Engineers, creating millions of jobs and unleashing the prosperity of the federal government for the benefit of the American people. So I want to thank you for having me on tonight to share with you some basic core principles of modern monetary theory and the future of economic justice. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. My social media handles are I am Delman Coates. And thank you again. I stand available to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Coates, for giving us a very detailed tour of a type of economic theory that we don't often think is possible, and it is regularly discredited there's regular attempted discrediting happening from people who. There used to be a party that we thought were deficit hawks that no longer exists. But we know on both sides of the aisle, there are people who either don't want us to know about the real economic power of our government, or they just really don't know how our money works. And I think both are morally alarming, since these are the people who are responsible for economic policy, for what happens to our jobs, what happens to our roads, what happens to our healthcare. So thank you for the way you bring this out and connect us to this. Deirdre, I want to ask you a question primarily around issue-based organizing. You heard Dr. Coates name this policy agenda and talk about this vision, this agenda for Black America. What are some ABCs, 1, 2, 3s for thinking about mobilizing voters through issue-based engagement? And I say this because everybody talks about swing voters, but when we talk about swing voters, we don't talk about young people, young Black, brown folk who are part of the Democratic Party who decided not to vote last election. And we don't talk about young Black people who are occupying our urban centers who have not voted and do not intend to vote, right? Is there a way for us to think about issue-based voting to engage these swing voters we don't often talk about, who have the power to really shape every election?
Thank you both for inviting me to this call. I'm going to take my Black woman privilege, and I'm going to answer the question that I want to answer. So I'm going to get to your question in a minute, but I want to go back to, I'm going to start with where Dr. Coates left off. So Dr. Coates, when I think about, in particular, Black churches, when I think about Black congregations in this country, as Dr. Francois started off talking, he said, we have all this power, and as Black folks, we go to the polls because why? If you poll Black folks, they say we go to the polls because our ancestors died for the right for us to go to the polls. But I promise you, if you ask a young Latinx person why they go to the polls, they're going to talk about immigration reform. If you ask an LGBTQ member of our community why they go to the polls, they're going to say marriage equality. They're going to say, you get what I'm saying? Like, they have a political agenda. What we have been missing this entire time has been our own agenda. When we walk into I'll give you a better one. It's about to happen. I know it's already happening to you, Dr. Coates. When these candidates call your office and say, I just want to come to your congregation, or you're streaming your service live this week. Can I be a part of your service? Look at all of the work it took to bring the power of the Black church together. And yet we surrender that power to these candidates based on just being in proximity to them. Not that we see ourselves as an organized powerhouse that then can ask and have answer, ask for some things. And so what I loved about how the way you ended this was like, here's our 4-point platform. This is what we need to ask every candidate about. and we need to stand firm on it as a part of our agenda. So we need to start there first. And then to your question, Dr. Francois, your question is like, how do we what I heard was, how do we redefine swing voter? How do we stop saying, how do we change our language and not call young people infrequent voters, but call them swing voters, that they are voting with their feet? And we just do that. Like, that's a language change. That, like, we need to change our language around that. And then we need to start organizing them. What I love about young people is that they know what they want. You know, they may not know all, like, everything that Dr. Coates just said, but they can smell the BS, right? Like, they know that, hey, this has not been working. And so no one has organized their boycott of any system, whether it's their boycott of the education system, whether it's, you get what I'm saying, like the boycott of the political process. We've not organized, structured, or talked about it as a boycott. We haven't said young people are voting with their feet. They are not participating in these processes that don't involve them. So we need to repent on that. We need to change our language and say, you know what? They're voting with their feet. We need to have a platform. We need to engage them where they are. Ask them, you know, is this right? What else do we need to put on our platform? And then begin to start our organizing work. And then the final thing I'm going to say about that is that, and I believe this in, like, I'm going to go to the grave with this one. Mobilization is a tool of our enemy. What we need is beloved community. And so we need a culture of organizing. If you call my daughter right now and you ask her, you know, do you want to watch this, you know, this Facebook Live? She's going to ask you about the turnout count. She's going to ask you about what the political platform. She's going to have a set of questions because she's been raised by an organizer that let you know that she's looking to ensure that what she's getting involved in is about power building and not just mobilization. And we get so caught up in mobilization, like, you know, I believe in the power of the protest. This is not anti-protest at all. In my mind, protest is, you know, our version of lamentation. We need that. We need public lamentation. But we also need to go back and say, what are the barriers, the institutional barriers that are creating the need to publicly lament? And so, again, I love this presentation from Dr. Coates because it gives us a foundation for how we go in and talk to the candidates before they become, you know, before we give them a vote. We should not give away our vote. Our vote should be as precious as, you know, money, for real. Like, people should have to earn our vote. And then once they've earned our vote, we understand that it is not a monarchy. Like, this is not, you know, this is not that we have blessed them and now they, for some reason, are going to just do everything correctly. No, we need to continue to talk to them throughout their time in office about what we want to see them doing. And so building a culture of organizing, a culture of democracy, where folks are always present in the halls of Congress, in their local school board, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll stop there.
Dr. Coates, are there any places in Congress, any people in Congress that you have identified as allies for the kind of economic vision, economic mechanics that you outlined?
That's a good question. And I'm going to answer this in a very interesting way. So right now, the Republican Party understands modern monetary theory. It understands, like you just said, there was a time when Republicans were anti-deficits, but they're only anti-deficits when the spending is for the people.
Yeah.
They're for deficit spending when the recipients and the beneficiaries of the public spending are going to be the rich and the people at the top, right? So this whole notion about deficit spending and sector balances, you know, resulting in surpluses that go to the people, Republicans understand that. They use that. They just use that for their, you know, their constituents. Democrats as I have met with them, you hear these Democrats who will define themselves as tax and spend Democrats. They sort of use this conventional framework because they say that the notion of fiscal irresponsibility was used by the other side as a weapon against them back in the 80s and 90s, right? And so we should really be concerned. But in terms of the explicit, allies of this framework, people like AOC, Ayanna Pressley, have some really good advisors. Some of you know I joined Congresswoman Omar back in September of last year when she and several others presented the House version of the federal job guarantee. It was a sample act informed by I think Senator Booker presented the Senate version. There are a few allies out there who are kind of understanding MMT. But here's the challenge that we've got to help move the needle on. MMT doesn't have to be framed as a partisan issue. This is why I kind of commented on the Republican side, because right now we have progressives who are fighting for things like Medicare for all and the Green New Deal. The problem is they still operate within the traditional mainstream fiscal policy framework when they attempt to explain how we're going to pay for it. Think about it. When you hear certain progressives like Senator Sanders or Senator Warren talk about Medicare for all, or talk about others talk about a Green New Deal, because they tend to operate within a traditional economic framework, they tend to start looking for where they can get the money to pay for their robust spending policies. And it often results in this kind of language. Well, if we just tax the billionaires and the quadrillionaires and the trillionaires, and if we just tax the corporations and make them pay their fair share, then we can get the money to fund this stuff. Or you can find other progressive organizations, I won't go into naming them, who have really great agendas and programs, but they'll say things like, well, if we defund the military spending, right, then we can then get the money to fund this other stuff. Now, let me be clear. There are legitimate reasons for taxation. I just haven't gone into it. There are legitimate reasons for taxing, the rich. There may be legitimate reasons for reducing the military budget. But the point of modern monetary theory is that it helps us to understand that we don't have to tax and we don't have to reduce these budgets. Get this, in order to spend. I need you to get that. That's the kicker. Why should public priorities of public education, healthcare, job creation, fixing the environment be held hostage to whether Jeff Bezos gets taxed? Because here's the thing, if we need their taxes in order to fund public priorities, then we need them to stay multi-billionaires and trillionaires. Think about that. We need the rich to stay uber rich if we need their money to fund public priorities. I really want to encourage readers to get this other book, get The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton, and also get this book called Racial Taxation by Camille Walsh. You got to get this book, Racial Taxation by Camille Walsh, because she helps us to understand that the whole concept of taxpayer dollars was created as a racist dog whistle in an era where being explicitly racist was no longer acceptable in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. So after Jim Crow is ending, and now people are, sending their kids to schools with black folks, and black folks are saying, hey, we want stuff too. Well, in an era where certain whites couldn't be racist any longer, it was no longer acceptable, they would use the notion of fiscal responsibility, or I don't want my taxpayer dollars, right, going to fund this other stuff. And we have right now in the Democratic Party in particular politicians still using these racist dog whistles that center around notions of fiscal responsibility and trying to manage the deficit. But when the country was giving us the New Deal and was doing all kinds of deficit spending for whites around housing, around jobs, no one cared about the deficit then. But now, when Black folks around the Great Society era and social safety net era, now when people start talking about programs and services and housing and opportunities and jobs for people of color and Black people, then the concern about this notion of deficit spending became a problem. We got to educate ourselves about macroeconomics, monetary policy, and fiscal policy. And we have got to tell the truth about the power of the federal government to fix every school in America, to double the salaries of public teachers right now. There are no constraints other than inflation. There are no fiscal policy constraints that prevent us from funding and providing everything we need in America today.
Deirdre Reed, you have the last word.
I have the last word. Oh, I don't know if I want to have the last word. I do want to say this one thing to Dr. Coates. That'll preach. And I mean it very literally. Like when I think about, evangelical Christians, they would always, they talk about like the cattle on a thousand hills are the Lord. It's like this idea of abundance. And so how do we take what you're saying? I get it from a social justice standpoint, but how can we put it in terms that Black pastors can preach about so that they can begin to do the consciousness raising work in the community? Because what you just described was a narrative shift. Like we need a narrative shift around this. And so that's exciting to me. I mean, again, like I said, that'll preach that we have all the money we need. All we need to do, we can reimagine because we don't have to worry about where the money comes from. And so that's exciting to me. And I guess the last word, especially because there should be a lot of pastors on this call, hopefully, and servant lay leaders. I'm just going to encourage you. There is a real attack on voting at this time. And there's some things that we're going to be able to do about them. There's a lot of things that we probably could have done if we weren't in the midst of the pandemic. But what I know for sure is that we are a voting block. Black church and Black folks are a voting block. And so we should get out the vote in this next election cycle. But what I really want you to leave with is like, don't let anybody in your pulpit and you don't ask them for anything. Because if we don't ask for anything, then we can't come back once they're elected and then have conversations about getting what we deserve. If we're going to show up, we shouldn't show up just because our ancestors died for the right for us to vote. We should show up because we know that those 4 pillars of that platform, we're going to be able to hold your feet to the fire. In that first 100, I want commitments. In that first 100 days of you being elected, will you have, commission folks for, MMT commission? Can we have 3 committees that work on expanding healthcare? Like we should ask for some things, because when we show up to the voting polls, we show out. And so if we're going to show out for this election, we need to get something out of it and not just buy it and come into your Men's Day program. That's what I got.
Good. Thank you so much, Dr. Coates. Thank you so much, Deirdre Reed, for sharing your expertise and for challenging us in ways that need to be centered in this election cycle, but the ways that need to be centered in how we think about voting. All of our churches need voting plans, and we need legislative agendas. And so I hope that you'll continue to plug into Freedom Summer and this experience across the next several weeks that we will be doing these types of programs. I need you right now to go to thefreedomsummer.org and click on the button that says register to vote. it is there that you can do three things. One, you can check your registration status. You need to do that now. Two, you can request an absentee ballot. We want you to do that as well if you need to do that. And thirdly, it gives you the opportunity to start the process of registering to vote. If you're in a state that allows online voter registration, it does it right there. If you're not, like I'm in New Jersey, it starts the process for voter registration. So go to thefreedomsummer.org, click on register to vote, and there you can do three things. I need everybody to do it. Everybody should at least check their voter registration status, because I got some brothers and sisters in Georgia who showed up at the polls in 2018 to vote for Idea's sister, and they were not able to vote. And they were discouraged from using a provisional ballot. And so we need to know if we're registered to vote. Now, I know that this has been taken by the public health world, but you need to know your status. And so know your voter registration status today. So if nothing else, go to thefreedomsummer.org and make sure you click on register to vote so you can make sure you're registered. You can make sure that you request an absentee, or you can make sure that you are registered to vote, because I don't want you to be like my brothers and sisters who went out to vote for Stacey Abrams and it didn't work out for them. And so we need to know our status, because there are movements at work to shut our vote down, because our vote matters that much. So I hope you'll be with us next Wednesday as we talk about youth justice and the 2020 election. And until then, peace.